Outlaw's widow agreed to cook for a cowboy, then found his face on her husband's wanted poster. She fed the stranger for 3 days, mended his clothes, and grew to trust his gentle ways. Then she walked into town and saw his face staring back at her from a wanted poster for her own husband's murder. The dust cloud appeared first, then the horse, then the man who would change everything. Clara Mae Hutchins stood on her porch, watching the rider approach through the shimmering heat of late afternoon. Her apron was stained with flour and worry, her hands still damp from washing dishes that belonged to a table set for one. The homestead stretched around her like a broken promise, sagging fence posts, cattle that wandered too close to the creek, and silence that pressed against her eardrums like cotton. She hadn't seen another soul in 3 weeks. The stranger rode a bay mare that looked as tired as he did. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across a face weathered by sun and something heavier than weather. When he reached the gate, he didn't dismount, just sat there, studying her the way a man studies a mirage, unsure if it might disappear. "Mom!" His voice carried the rasp of a man who'd spent too many nights sleeping under stars instead of roofs. "Names. Tom. Tom Miller." The pause before his name was so brief, she almost missed it. "I'm wondering if you might have work for an honest man. Food in exchange for labor." Clara Mae's fingers found the wooden railing, gripping it like an anchor. She'd learned to read men the way others read weather, and this one carried storm clouds. But beneath the wariness, she saw something else. Hunger, not just for food, but for the kind of simple human decency that had become rare as rain in this corner of nowhere. "What kind of work?" she asked, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. How long since she'd spoken to anyone but the chickens? He gestured toward her sagging fence with one gloved hand. "That fence won't hold through winter. Your cattle are wandering near the creek bed. Good way to lose them to rustlers or worse. And your roof's got loose shingles." He paused, then added quietly, "A woman alone shouldn't have to worry about such things." The words hit her like a gentle blow. A woman alone. That's what she was now, what she'd been for 8 months since Samuel rode away on business that never brought him home. She studied the stranger's face, what she could see of it beneath the hat's shadow. There was something careful about the way he held himself, like a man trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. "I can cook," she said finally. "Beans and cornbread. Coffee if you don't mind it strong." "Ma'am, I'd be grateful for anything you could spare." She watched him dismount, noting how he moved, fluid, practiced like someone comfortable with danger. But when he removed his hat as he approached the porch, the gesture was so naturally respectful that something tight in her chest loosened. His hair was dark brown, sun-streaked, and too long, falling across his forehead. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and distant. "Thank you kindly," he said, and meant it. Inside the small kitchen, Clara Mae moved with the efficiency of a woman who'd learned to find purpose in routine. She'd been cooking for one so long that preparing food for two felt like muscle memory from another life. The beans had been simmering since morning. She always made too much, hoping somehow that Samuel might walk through the door and need feeding. The stranger, Tom, waited on the porch until she called him in. He sat at the small wooden table her husband had built during their first winter, his large frame making the chair creak. His hands were clean but scarred, she noticed, marked by rope and leather and things that cut. "You live here alone?" he asked as she set the plate before him. "My husband's away on business." The lie came easily now, smooth as river stones. She couldn't bring herself to say the word widow out loud. As long as she didn't say it, maybe it wasn't completely true. Tom nodded, not pressing. He ate with careful appreciation, the way hungry men do when they remember their manners. "Fine cooking, mime. Been a while since I've had a proper meal." "Where are you headed?" "Nowhere particular." He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. Sometimes a man just needs to keep moving until he finds a reason to stop. Something in his voice made her look at him more closely. In the lamplight, she could see his face properly for the first time. Strong jaw marked by a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Eyes that carried too much knowledge of dark things. but there was gentleness there too, in the way he held his fork, in how he waited for her to sit before continuing to eat. What kind of business takes a man away from his wife for so long? Tom asked quietly. Clara Mae's hands stilled on her coffee cup. The kind that doesn't bring him home. They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that some truths were too heavy for words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shingles he'd mentioned. A coyote called from somewhere beyond the creek, lonely and wild. "I'll start on that fence tomorrow," Tom said as he finished eating. "If you'll have me. Where will you sleep?" "Barn's fine by me. I've slept in worse." Clara Mae watched him stand, watched him settle his hat back on his head with practiced ease. There was something about his movements that nagged at her, familiar but impossible to place. Like a half-remembered dream. "Mr. Miller," she said as he reached the door. He turned back, and for just a moment, the lamplight caught his full face without shadows. Something flickered in her memory, not quite recognition, but close enough to make her breath catch. "Thank you," she finished lamely. "For the help, I mean. Thank you for the meal, ma'am. Best I've had in longer than I care to remember." After he left for the barn, Clara Mae cleared the table slowly, savoring the simple pleasure of washing 2 plates instead of 1. But as she dried her hands on her apron, that nagging feeling returned. Something about the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the careful politeness that seemed designed to keep the world at arm's length. She shook her head, telling herself that loneliness made a person see ghosts in every shadow. But as she blew out the lamp and headed toward her empty bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that Tom Miller was running from something, and that whatever it was had teeth sharp enough to follow him all the way to her door. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming rain and the distant sound of a man who couldn't sleep, pacing the barn like a caged animal. Clara Mae lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of hunger had really brought him to her table, and whether feeding it had been an act of mercy or the first step toward her own destruction. She fed him for 3 days, then saw his face on the wanted poster for her husband's murder. 3 days passed like a prayer answered. Clara Mae woke each morning to the sound of Tom's hammer against wood, the steady rhythm becoming as familiar as her own heartbeat. He worked with the quiet intensity of a man who understood that idle hands led to darker thoughts. By the 2nd day, her fence stood straight and true. By the 3rd, he'd patched the worst of her roof and guided her wandering cattle back from the creek with a patience that spoke of someone who knew animals better than people. She found herself cooking larger portions, adding extra salt pork to the beans, baking fresh cornbread when yesterday's would have sufficed. Not because he never asked for anything, but because the simple act of feeding someone felt like resurrection. Her kitchen came alive again with purpose, steam rising from pots like incense, the warm smell of baking bread filling corners that had grown cold with disuse. Tom ate with the same careful gratitude each evening, always waiting for her to sit before he touched his fork, always complimenting the meal even when she knew it was nothing special. After supper, they'd sit on the porch while the sun bled across the horizon, not talking much but comfortable in the shared silence. He whittled small figures from scraps of wood, horses mostly, and birds, leaving them on the porch rail like tiny offerings. "You're handy with a knife," Clara Mae observed on the 2nd evening, watching a wooden sparrow take shape in his weathered hands. "My brother taught me," Tom said quietly. Said a man should be able to create something beautiful, even if his hands knew how to destroy. The way he spoke of his brother, past tense, with careful tenderness, told her everything she needed to know about loss. They were both citizens of grief, she realized, carrying their dead in different ways. On the 3rd morning, Clara Mae woke to find a bucket of fresh milk on her porch. Tom had somehow coaxed her stubborn cow into cooperation, something Samuel had never managed in 2 years of trying. The simple kindness of it nearly brought her to tears. "How did you know Bessie would give milk?" she asked over breakfast. Tom smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face completely, revealing the man he might have been before whatever darkness had claimed him. Animals know when you're patient with them, when you don't try to take more than they're willing to give. That afternoon, supplies ran low. Clara Mae hadn't been to town since Tom's arrival, too caught up in the strange comfort of having another person share her space. But the flour bin was nearly empty, and coffee was down to dregs. She hitched her wagon with hands that trembled slightly, not from the work, but from the prospect of leaving the small bubble of peace they'd built together. "I'll be back before supper," she told Tom as he helped her into the wagon seat. "I'll be here," he said, and something in his voice made it sound like a promise deeper than the words themselves. The ride to town felt longer than usual, as if the landscape itself was reluctant to let her go. Dust devils danced across the scrubland, and the sun pressed down like a heavy hand. She found herself hurrying through her errands: flour, coffee, salt, a few precious strips of jerky, eager to return to the comfort of routine. The general store buzzed with more activity than usual. Mrs. Henderson gossiped with the blacksmith's wife near the penny candy, while old Pete nursed a bottle of whiskey by the checkerboard. Clara Mae gathered her supplies quickly, nodding politely but avoiding conversation. Town folk had stopped asking about Samuel months ago, but she could still feel their pity like smoke in the air. She was counting out coins for the flour when she saw them. Fresh wanted posters, tacked to the wall beside the door like a gallery of the damned. Her eyes moved across them automatically. The usual collection of rustlers and murderers and men who'd chosen the wrong side of the law. Then her gaze stopped, and the world tilted sideways. The sketch was crude, drawn by someone with more dedication than talent. But the strong jaw was unmistakable. The deep-set eyes, the scar that ran from ear to mouth like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. Black Jack Torino, the poster declared in bold letters. Wanted for murder and robbery. 500 reward. Armed and dangerous. Below the drawing, smaller text told the story that made her legs go weak. Sought in connection with the killing of Samuel Hutchins during a bank robbery in Dry Creek. Considered extremely dangerous. Do not approach. The coins slipped from Clara Mae's fingers, scattering across the wooden floor like her world coming apart. "Mrs. Henderson looked up from her gossip, concerned, but Clara Mae couldn't hear whatever kindness the woman offered. The blood rushing in her ears drowned out everything except the terrible truth staring at her from that wall. Tom Miller, Jack Torino, the man who'd mended her fence and milked her cow and sat at her table with hat in hand, had put a bullet in her husband's chest. She gathered the coins with shaking hands, paid for her supplies, and walked to her wagon like a woman moving through deep water. The ride home stretched endlessly, each bump in the road jolting her back to awareness of the gun hidden under her wagon seat. Samuel's old Colt, loaded and ready for emergencies she'd never imagined. By the time she reached the homestead, the sun was setting, painting everything the color of blood. Tom, Jack, whatever his name was, emerged from the barn where he'd been mucking stalls. He raised his hand in greeting, that same gentle smile she'd come to expect. "How was town?" he called, walking toward her with easy confidence. Clara Mae climbed down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady. She looked at him, really looked, and wondered how she'd missed it. The careful way he watched the horizon. The practiced silence when she mentioned Samuel. The haunted quality in his eyes that spoke of guilt carried like stones in his pockets. "Fine," she managed, her voice sounding foreign. "Just fine." He moved to help her with the supplies, and she forced herself not to flinch when his hand brushed hers reaching for the flour sack. Those hands had killed her husband. Those same hands had gently carved wooden sparrows and mended her broken fence. "I'll get supper started," she said, backing toward the house. "Clara Mae." His voice stopped her. "You all right? You look pale." The concern in his voice was real. She could hear it, genuine as gospel. This man who'd murdered Samuel was worried about her well-being, and the contradiction felt like trying to hold water and fire in the same cup. "Just tired from the heat," she lied. Inside her kitchen, Clara Mae's hands shook as she lit the stove. The familiar routine felt different now, poisoned by knowledge. Every movement was deliberate, careful, as she tried to decide what to do with the truth that sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. Through the window, she watched Jack, finish his work, moving with the same quiet competence that had charmed her. When full darkness fell, he'd come to her table expecting supper and kindness, and she'd have to look into the face of her husband's killer and decide whether mercy or justice would guide her hand. The beans bubbled on the stove, filling the air with the same comforting smell as always. But comfort was a luxury she could no longer afford. Tonight, she would serve supper to a murderer, and the terrible question was, what would she serve alongside it? She aimed the shotgun at her husband's killer. Then he told her the truth about the man she'd married. Clara Mae's hands found Samuel's shotgun in the dark closet, her fingers remembering the weight of it from nights when coyotes threatened the chickens. The metal was cold against her palms, heavy with the promise of endings. She'd never aimed it at a man before, but tonight, everything was different. Outside, she could hear Tom moving around the barn, settling his horse for the night. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. The sounds of a man who had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to shatter like glass against stone. She waited by the kitchen window, watching for his lantern. When it bobbed toward the house, she stepped onto the porch, the shotgun cradled in her arms like a sleeping child. The night air was cool against her face, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "Tom," she called softly. He looked up, and even in the dim light, she saw him register the gun. His steps slowed but didn't stop. When he reached the porch, he set the lantern down carefully and raised his hands, palms open. "I reckon you found something in town," he said quietly. "Jack Torino." The name fell from her lips like a stone down a well. "That's your real name, isn't it?" His shoulders sagged as if she'd cut the strings holding him upright. For a long moment, he just stood there, hands still raised, looking older than his years. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. "Yes, ma'am. It is. You killed my husband." "I did." The simple admission hit her harder than denial would have. No excuses, no justifications, just the plain truth spoken like a man confessing to a priest. Clara Mae's finger moved to the trigger, but something in his stillness stopped her. "Why?" The word came out broken. Jack lowered his hands slowly, keeping them visible. "May I sit? This is a long story, and you deserve to hear all of it." She gestured with the gun barrel toward the porch steps. He sat heavily, like a man carrying too much weight for too long. The lantern light carved deep shadows across his face, making him look like a man carved from stone and regret. "Your husband came to us with a proposition," Jack began, his voice steady but quiet. "Said he knew about a bank shipment. Easy money with no one getting hurt. My brother Billy was young, maybe 22, and he needed money for medicine. His lungs were bad, had been since he was a boy. Clara Mae kept the gun trained on him, but found herself listening despite everything. Samuel said it would be simple. Wait for the wagon outside Dry Creek, take the money right away. No violence. But when we stopped that wagon, Jack's voice caught, and he was quiet for a moment. It wasn't bank money. It was a collection for the widow Morrison and her 3 children. Money the whole town had scraped together to keep them from starving through winter. The words hit Clara Mae like physical blows. She remembered widow Morrison, remembered Samuel mentioning something about a collection, remembered how he'd come home with new boots that week and claimed he'd won them in a card game. "I told Samuel we were calling it off," Jack continued. "Told him we didn't rob from widows and orphans. But he got desperate. Said he needed that money, that he'd already promised it to someone. When I tried to stop him, he drew on me." Jack looked up at her, his pale eyes reflecting the lantern light. "I'm faster than most men, Mrs. Hutchins, but I'm not proud of it." "You're lying." But even as she said it, Clara Mae could hear the doubt in her own voice. Samuel had come home different that week, jumpy and secretive. He'd left 3 days later, claiming business in the next territory. She'd never seen him again. "Billy got shot in the confusion," Jack said, his voice growing rough. "Took him 2 days to die, and every minute of it was on Samuel's head. Your husband rode away with blood money, while my brother coughed up his life in the dirt. Clara Mae felt the shotgun growing heavier in her arms. Samuel wouldn't. Samuel owed money to some bad men. Jack interrupted gently. The kind that break bones when you can't pay. He was desperate, and desperate men do desperate things. He paused, studying her face. You never wondered where he got the money for those new clothes? The expensive boots? The watch he wore that last week. She had wondered. Samuel had been a poor provider, good with cards but bad with everything else. The sudden wealth had seemed like a blessing then. Now it felt like poison in her memory. After Billy died, I tracked Samuel for 3 months, Jack continued. It wasn't hard. He spent money like a man with no tomorrow. When I finally caught up with him in Carterville, I just wanted answers. Wanted him to look me in the eye and tell me my brother died for something that mattered. But you killed him. He drew first. Jack's voice was flat, final. Maybe he thought he was faster. Maybe he was just tired of running. But when a man reaches for his gun, you don't get time to think about mercy. Clara Mae stared at him. This man who'd fixed her fence and carved wooden birds and spoken to her with more respect than her own husband had shown in years. The terrible thing was that she believed him. Every word rang true, fitting together like puzzle pieces she'd been refusing to see. Why did you come here? She whispered. Guilt, maybe. Curiosity. I wanted to see what kind of woman Samuel had left behind. Wanted to know if. He trailed off, then started again. I never meant to stay. Was going to look at the place and ride on. But you offered me food, and it had been so long since anyone had shown me simple kindness. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Clara Mae could hear her own breathing, the distant call of a night bird, the soft rustle of wind through dry grass. 3 days of peace, built on a foundation of lies and blood. The man I married, she said slowly, wasn't the man I thought he was. No, ma'am, I don't reckon he was. And you're not the man the poster says you are. Jack looked up at her, surprise flickering across his features. I killed your husband, Mrs. Hutchins. That makes me exactly what the poster says. Does it? Clara Mae lowered the shotgun, not setting it aside, but no longer aiming it at his heart. Samuel left me with debts I can't pay and questions I can't answer. He took money meant for a widow and her children. He got your brother killed over greed. She paused, the words bitter on her tongue. Tell me, Mr. Torino, in 3 days here, have you taken anything from me? Have you shown me anything but respect and honest work? Jack stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. I took your husband's life. Samuel took his own life the moment he decided stolen money was worth more than honor. The words surprised her with their certainty. You just finished what he started. They sat in the growing darkness, two broken people trying to make sense of a world that dealt cards from the bottom of the deck. Above them, stars emerged one by one, distant and cold as justice. Finally, Jack spoke. I should ride on. Being here, knowing what I've done to you, it ain't right. Clara Mae looked at him, really looked, and saw not a killer but a man carrying a burden too heavy for any one person to bear alone. In the lamplight, his face was marked by more than scars. It was marked by the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Maybe, she said quietly, but morning's still hours away, and some truths are too heavy to carry alone in the dark. She had every right to turn him in for the bounty. Instead, she set breakfast on the table and made a choice that would change both their lives forever. Dawn came slow and uncertain, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. Clara Mae stood at her kitchen window, watching Jack split wood behind the barn, each swing of the axe deliberate and measured. He'd been up before the sun, she knew, because she'd heard him moving around in the darkness, restless as a caged animal. Neither of them had slept much after the truth had settled between them like dust after a storm. She'd made coffee, strong and black, the way he liked it. The routine felt different now, not comfortable exactly, but necessary. Like breathing. Her hands moved without conscious thought, cracking eggs into the skillet, slicing bread she'd baked yesterday when the world still made sense in simple ways. The breakfast table waited, set for 2, as it had been for 3 mornings running. But this morning, Jack hesitated at the threshold, hat in his hands, looking like a man who'd forgotten how to cross a room. "Mrs. Hutchins," he said quietly, "I should be moving on. Coffee's getting cold," she replied without turning around. "You know what I am. I know what you've done. That's not the same thing." She could feel him studying her back, trying to read the thoughts she wasn't ready to share. Finally, his boots crossed the threshold, and she heard him settle into his chair with the careful movements of a man who knew he didn't deserve such simple grace. Clara Mae set his plate before him, eggs over easy, bacon, thick slices of bread, and took her own seat. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of the past few days. This silence carried weight, questions that hadn't been asked, and answers that might change everything. "I was 17 when I married Samuel," she said finally, not looking up from her eggs. "Thought I knew what love was supposed to look like. Thought marriage was about finding someone who'd take care of you." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Turns out I spent 10 years taking care of a man who couldn't even take care of his own honor." Jack's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Mrs. Hutchins, Clara Mae," she corrected. "If we're going to speak truth to each other, you might as well use my name." "Clara Mae." He said it carefully, like testing the weight of something fragile. "What Samuel did, it doesn't make what I did right." "No," she agreed. "But it doesn't make it wrong, either." "Not entirely." She told him about the baby then. The son she'd lost 3 winters ago, born too early and too small to survive the harsh frontier. About the nights she'd lain awake afterward, hollow and aching, while Samuel disappeared into card games and whiskey bottles. About the debts he'd left her with, the promises he'd broken, the way he'd looked through her like she was made of glass. "I grieved for him," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening behind her eyes. "But I think I was grieving for the man I wanted him to be, not the man he was." Jack listened without interrupting, his breakfast growing cold. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the land he'd helped repair. "My brother Billy used to say that some men are born with holes in their hearts," he said finally. "Spend their whole lives trying to fill them with things that don't fit. Money, whiskey, violence." He looked at her then, his pale eyes honest and unguarded. "I've been carrying his death like a stone in my chest for 8 months. But these 3 days, helping you, sitting at this table, it's the first time that stone felt lighter." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe some kinds of justice don't come from wanted posters and bounty hunters. Maybe sometimes it comes from this." He gestured around the kitchen, at the simple domestic peace they'd built together. "Billy always said the best revenge against darkness was to strike a light somewhere." Clara Mae studied his face, seeing past the scar and the weathered skin to something deeper. Here was a man who'd killed her husband, but who'd also shown her more genuine care in 3 days than Samuel had in 3 years. The contradiction should have torn her apart, but instead, it felt like the first honest thing she'd encountered in longer than she could remember. "The law will come eventually," she said. "Probably. They'll offer a reward for information." $500, Jack confirmed. "That's a lot of money for a woman in your situation." She could turn him in, could ride to town this afternoon, and come back with the sheriff and enough money to pay off Samuel's debts, maybe even start over somewhere new. It would be the practical thing, the sensible thing, the safe thing. Instead, she stood and refilled his coffee cup. "I lost a child once," she said, settling back into her chair. "Doctor said it was God's will, but I never understood how taking away something so small and innocent could be anyone's will but the devil's." She paused, watching steam rise from his cup. "But Billy was someone's child too, wasn't he?" Jack's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "He was. Our ma died when he was born, and our pa was, well, he wasn't much of a father. Billy was more mine than his, if that makes sense." "It does. He never hurt anyone in his life. Never even raised his voice in anger. Just wanted enough money to see a real doctor, maybe find some medicine that would help him breathe easier." Jack's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "He died in my arms, asking me to forgive him for getting shot. Like it was his fault." Clara Mae reached across the table then, her fingers covering his scarred knuckles. The touch was electric, dangerous, like grabbing lightning. But she didn't pull away. Samuel made his choice, she said firmly. And you made yours. But what happens next? That's a choice we make together. What are you saying? I'm saying that the fence you fixed will keep my cattle safe through winter. I'm saying that the roof you patched will keep the rain out. I'm saying that you've done more good in 3 days than Samuel did in 10 years. She squeezed his hands. I'm saying that maybe Billy's death doesn't have to be the end of the story. Maybe it can be the beginning of something else. Jack stared at her as if she'd spoken in tongues. You can't mean, I mean that this land is too big for one person alone. I mean that some debts can't be paid with money, but they can be paid with time and care and honest work. She met his eyes steadily. I mean that if you're willing to stay, I'm willing to let you. The law will come when it comes. But until then, we have work to do. Cattle to tend, a garden to plant come spring, a life to build from the pieces we have left. Jack pulled his hands free and stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. He stood there with his back to her, shoulders rigid with conflict. You don't understand what you're offering, he said finally. I understand exactly what I'm offering. Clara Mae set the shotgun aside, leaning it against the wall. I'm offering forgiveness to a man who needs it. I'm offering a chance for 2 broken people to maybe become something whole. And if they catch me, if they hang me, then at least you'll have had some peace before the end. And I'll have had someone who saw me as more than just a burden to bear. Jack turned back to her, and in the lamplight, she could see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. Why? He whispered. Because Billy deserved better than dying for stolen money. Because you deserved better than carrying that guilt alone. And because, she paused, searching for words that felt true. Because Samuel's been gone for 8 months, but I didn't start living again until 3 days ago. The silence that followed was different from all the others. Not empty, but full of possibility. Jack walked back to the table, picked up his coffee cup, and drank deeply. When he set it down, his hands were steady. I can't promise I'll always be here, he said quietly, but I can promise that as long as I am, you'll never want for anything I can provide. Clara Mae smiled then, the first real smile she'd worn since before Samuel left. That's more than I've had in a long time. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of rain and the scent of change. Inside the small kitchen, 2 people who'd found each other in the wreckage of their separate tragedies sat in comfortable silence, planning tomorrow's work and learning to believe in second chances. The dust would settle where it would. But for now, there was coffee growing warm, bread that needed baking, and the quiet miracle of no longer being alone in a world too vast for solitary hearts.